Coming up on PrimeTime Politics Weekend, a new leader for Alberta.
Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter in the Alberta story. It is time for Alberta to take its place as a senior partner in building a strong and unified Canada.
Danielle Smith emerges from the political ashes to win the United Conservative leadership race, upending former cabinet ministers and winning support for her tough talk against Ottawa. What will this mean for federal-provincial relations? Also, cracking down on Iran.
We're taking steps that will raise the bar internationally in holding Iran accountable.
Ottawa unveils new sanctions but falls short of listing Iran's Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist entity. What impact does that hesitation have? And a warning from a former top security advisor.
It's not reasonable to ask the Canadian Forces to train or not train for this function.
Are political leaders hurting the military by using them too often to deal with natural disasters? This is PrimeTime Politics Weekend. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. In 2014, she was a political pariah, but today, Danielle Smith is the leader of Alberta's United Conservative Party and will be sworn in come Tuesday as the province's 19th premier.
No longer will Alberta ask permission from Ottawa to be prosperous and free. We will not have our voices silenced and censored. We will not be told what we must put in our bodies in order to work or to travel. We will not have our resources landlocked or our energy phased out of existence by virtue signaling prime ministers.
Campaigning on an Alberta First platform and the promise of a controversial Alberta Sovereignty Act, Danielle Smith beat out top contenders, among them the former Alberta Finance Minister Travis Toews and the man who succeeded her when she abandoned the leadership of the Wildrose Party, Brian Jean. Well, Graham Thomson is a political commentator who's been following the UCP leadership right from the very beginning. He joins us once again today. Graham, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So you called it. So I guess you had to join us, but you called it. Danielle Smith, she won, but really not on the first ballot that she was hoping for, instead on the sixth ballot. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells you the party is still very much divided. Yes, she was hoping for a first ballot victory, but because the division in the party, and there was 7 candidates in this race, 5 of them basically were anti-Smith candidates. In fact, 4 candidates had a news conference a few weeks ago, united in slamming Smith's policies, particularly the Sovereignty Act, the one that she says will allow her to ignore federal law she doesn't like. So a real split, and in fact, it went to 6 counts. In other words, the first count, she did not win a majority, and then to do a second, a third, and a fourth. It goes to 6. And this shows the division within the party. And this shows that she has a long uphill climb, not just to win over Albertans. There'll be an election coming up in May. She has to heal the very big fractures within her own party. And Travis Toews, the finance minister, hasn't said if he'll even run under a banner with Premier Smith in the next election. So we'll see how she can actually heal those risks, because that's key to her actually potentially winning the next election, is actually to make the party, the United Conservative Party, much more united. Very divided during this leadership race, and she was the cause of much of that division.
Yeah, it's interesting. You use the word division. You mentioned Travis Toews, and when you looked at what was happening in the room on Thursday night, Travis Toews, who did come in second, he was surrounded by other MLAs. Some of those MLAs were in tears. So here we have a new UCP leader, but I'm actually also wondering how much of a wholesale change are we going to see when it comes to the government front bench?
Yeah, this is a good question, because the thing is, now she will want to put some of these people who were in the race into cabinet, particularly Travis Toews. He finished second, and he was the establishment candidate, the one really that Jason Kenney, the outgoing premier, really wanted to win. Not that Kenney said it in so many words, but Travis Toews was the establishment, and she really wants to have him in cabinet to show solidarity. But she also has a lot of other MLAs near the end who began supporting her. and she'll want to reward them, even though most MLAs, more than 20 MLAs, were supporting Travis Taves, and they're shocked by last night's results because they thought that he had a really good chance at winning. So what's going to happen now? She'll be sworn in on Tuesday. We'll see just how quickly she puts together a cabinet. But it has to be a cabinet showing there's some sort of unity within this caucus that's been so badly divided, and she'll want Travis Taves in there. But we'll see what actually happens next week.
Yeah, so a look at to see who actually makes up her cabinet. But I'm also wondering about how she's going to operate as Premier after sworn in, because here we have Ms. Smith really promising to fight harder for Alberta. But her predecessor, as you know, Jason Kenney, also promised the same thing. And it is one thing to make a promise before getting the job. It's another delivering. What can we expect from Danielle Smith?
Yeah, it's a good point, Michael, because you go back to 2019 in that election campaign. You had Jason Kenney promising a war room to fight back the disinformation about the oil sands, and a public inquiry into environmental groups that he said were landlocking the oil sands and using foreign money to fight Alberta's energy industry, and also have a referendum on equalization to bring down equalization and get more money for Alberta. None of that worked. It played to an audience who thought, oh my goodness, he's really going to stand up for Alberta. But those who voted really against him in the leadership review back in May were those who thought he didn't go far enough. And Smith, throughout the campaign, said, look, Kenney made these promises and didn't follow through, just saying, I will follow through. So she has stepped up her game by bringing in, she says, this Alberta Sovereignty Act that will allow her not just to yell at Ottawa, but actually, she says, ignore federal laws that she doesn't like. So she's raised the bar pretty high with her supporters who expect her to follow through, where Jason Kenney didn't. But the thing is, those promises Kenney made were all dead ends. They weren't going to work. They were unconstitutional, or they were just ended up being a joke. The war room became a joke. The public inquiry into un-Alberta activities by environmental groups didn't find any wrongdoing. In fact, Kenney got sued by the environmental groups. So it's one thing, you're right, to make a promise, one thing to follow through. But right now, this kind of promise got her chosen last night, Thursday night, as the winner in this leadership race.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's worthwhile to dig into this Alberta Sovereignty Act, because there really are still so many questions around it. As you said, you know, Danielle Smith at one point explaining it as a means of saying no to any scheme or policy that Alberta opposes coming out of Ottawa. But she also has moderated a bit by also saying really what it is a defense of the division of powers as outlined in the Constitution. Do we have any idea, a better idea at least, of how a Sovereignty Act might work, what it might actually look like?
No, because what happened here is that the Sovereignty Act was not written by her. There was this policy put forward by a group called the Free Alberta Strategy, and the authors of that Alberta Sovereignty Act have said it's designed to be unconstitutional. It's designed to provoke Ottawa and create chaos so that Alberta can help change the Constitution or give more powers back from the federal government to Alberta. But the thing is, now she has taken that and run with it. But she is saying, she's played a game with us on this. She's saying, on one hand, yes, it will give Alberta the power to ignore federal laws and ignore court decisions that are deemed to be infringing on Alberta rights. But at the same time, when she's pushing it, she said, oh, all I'm doing here is codifying what's in the Constitution. So you got to wonder, well, if it's already in the Constitution, why do you need to codify it provincially? And what's happening here is that we don't actually know the act, how she's actually going to frame it. She hasn't written it. She's saying, don't judge it until you actually see it. So it may be very much watered down. It may be very much a paper tiger. But she has brought this forward throughout the campaign to galvanize her base, to people who really do think that Ottawa's out to destroy Alberta. All the Albertans who voted for Jason Kenney in 2019, cheering on his war room and public inquiry, and they were disappointed he didn't follow through. She's saying, look, I will follow through. In fact, I'll codify this into law in Alberta. What the actual law will say, we don't know yet. She's going to have to, you would think, tone it down, because even people in her own caucus have said, this would be unconstitutional as it's written in the Free Alberta Strategy. So we still have to wait and see. Now, she's going to bring it in, she says, in November, and we'll see exactly what it is then.
Okay. Well, we are watching very closely. Graham, really good to speak to you again. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
That's Graham Thomson.
There are those in Ottawa and the establishment, even some in Alberta, that don't want to see our party be unified. They don't want us to succeed. And sadly, these folks will do and say almost anything to keep us from succeeding. They will dredge up old statements and mistakes from the past. They will use cancel culture and fear-mongering in an attempt to scare and dissuade Albertans from supporting our MLAs and me. For example, it is safe to say that many in the Notley Singh Trudeau alliance will claim that my plan to stand up to Ottawa with the Sovereignty Act is somehow meant to move Alberta toward leaving our beloved Canada. That is a lie. What Albertans want is for our province and all provinces to have our rights under the Constitution of Canada protected and respected by an increasingly hostile Ottawa regime that seeks to control every aspect of our lives.
So a bit more there from Danielle Smith and her victory speech from Thursday night. And as you heard, more than one reference about Ottawa and federal politics. So for more, let's bring in our weekend journalist panel. Joanna Smith is the Ottawa bureau chief for the Canadian Press. John Ibbitson is a columnist and staff writer at large for the Globe and Mail. Nice to see both of you. Thanks for being here.
Hello.
So, Joanna, I'm going to ask you to start us off here. Danielle Smith, promising to fight harder for Alberta. She's promising to bring about an Alberta Sovereignty Act. What's been the reaction to that kind of language here in Ottawa?
I think there's a bit of wait and see. I think there was a lot of reaction to the reaction that she was getting. Now former Premier Jason Kenney came out and called it, I think, a cockamamie idea, and there's a lot of reaction about how this is unworkable, unconstitutional. So I think there was a bit of a wait and see. I know we asked Trudeau about it not long ago, and his remarks were frankly so unremarkable that I couldn't even remark upon what he said. I think behind closed doors, there's a lot of trying to figure out about what this bill, when it does come, will actually look like, and what sort of specific problems it will present for the federal government on a legislative or constitutional front. But I think really at its core, it's a lot about politics. It's a lot about identity politics for the province of Alberta and the people of Alberta, and this long-standing us versus them. We see this in other provinces across the country as well. But I think this will, at the end of the day, be far more about politics, about a fight for who speaks for Alberta, about a fight for who gets to represent for Alberta, and an us versus them, than it will really be about what the bill and its details look like and what the impact it will have.
Yeah, and Joanna brings up a good point here, John. We still don't really know what the details of this act is going to look like. But given the fact that it's kind of based on this idea of us versus them, how worrying is that for federal politicians here in Ottawa?
It should be more worrying than it is. Look, I think Joanna's point about wait and see is what matters most. This bill is going to have to be introduced. On its face, it's wildly unconstitutional. It flouts the division of powers between the federal and provincial governments. I'm finding it hard to believe that there's a reputable constitutional lawyer who would sit before a legislative committee and defend the bill. Nonetheless, the bill will get passed eventually, but we have an election in Alberta at the end of May next year. There's a very good chance the New Democrats will return to power, and this whole thing will go away. I think what the Trudeau Liberals are hoping for most is that the bill will take the time it takes to get passed. By the time it does get passed, they'll already be in election mode, and the NDP will return to power, and this whole thing will go away. But it is an amazing reflection of how federal-provincial relations have deteriorated under Justin Trudeau. In 2015, when he came to power, there had been peace with the provinces, between the provinces and the federal government, for a decade under Stephen Harper. The last separatist government had come and gone in Quebec. There was a dust-up with Newfoundland, but nothing really serious. And the rest of the federation was at peace. 7 years later, you have a quasi-separatist government coming to power in Alberta. You have François Legault in Quebec defying the government on immigration policy. You have a revived Bloc Québécois. You want to know what happens when you impose carbon taxes against provincial will? You want to know what happens when you impose health restrictions on the provinces against their will? This is what happens. You get a federation that is 1 degree short of on the boil. And Justin Trudeau has to take full responsibility for that.
Joanna, how would you respond to that statement?
I think at the end of the day, in addition to the political challenges it'll cause for Trudeau, it's going to bog things down. It's going to be one more thing that makes it harder for the federal government to pass its legislation, to advance on its agenda, to convince people that its agenda is worth following, which has been an uphill battle, right? Trudeau has been talking for years about the need to have the environment and the economy work together, and we're in a situation with inflation, with rising gas prices, where the argument about how the carbon price works has been lost. I mean, there are rebates. I feel like they're maybe not always stressing that enough, that people are actually getting money back for this. This is a challenge. They have a communications challenge. I don't know if they fully recognize how serious that challenge is. And when you then have someone like Danielle Smith, now Premier of Alberta, Premier Designate of Alberta, whipping up that sentiment, saying, not putting a message of let's go along to get along, not putting a message across to say that it is better to cooperate with Ottawa for the good of the entire country, that we are a country that is of provinces and territories, and we are a federation. If you have someone saying Ottawa's taking from us, Ottawa's getting in our way, it presents a real challenge. It gets other provinces thinking in that direction as well. And as I was saying before, it really creates that us versus them, that, when you are the prime minister, when you are the federal government, and you are trying to say that you want to do big things that involve cooperation across the entire country, if you have people really rowing in a different direction in a very determined way, that it gets that much harder to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, John, you paint a picture of a Trudeau government that has painted itself into a corner when it comes to federal-provincial relations. Now, as we are noting here, there is a new leader in Alberta to be sworn in the week ahead as the 19th Premier of Alberta. If Ottawa / the Trudeau government wants to perhaps diffuse some of the rhetoric early, how do they do that, given that Danielle Smith has already promised to be harder with the federal government?
I don't think there's anything that they can do. Both sides are, at this point, intractable. The federal government, the Liberal government, is going to continue to pursue a policy of raising taxes on carbon. The Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre are going to continue to lacerate them for doing exactly that. The Smith government, especially because it's going into an election, is going to be as confrontational as possible, with very much an us versus them. The NDP, I think, will try to find something closer to a happy medium in promising to stand up for the rights of Albertans and standing up for the rights of the oil and gas sector in Alberta, while not going to low-level political civil war with Ottawa. And Francois Legault in Quebec will continue to pursue his strategy of attempting to achieve greater autonomy for Quebec in the field of immigration and the culture and elsewhere. And we will just carry on with this. There's not going to be much change unless and until there's a change of government in Alberta, which I suspect is the case. The polls suggest that the NDP is very well placed, and Danielle Smith may have found the ability to rile the base of the United Conservative Party in Alberta. But this is a cosmopolitan, diverse province, highly urbanized province. It would surprise me if Albertans, in the main, accepted something this confrontational from their government. They're more likely to go to the NDP. But in the meantime, I have to say, we're just going to sit and wait. There's nothing that Ottawa can do. There's nothing that Pierre Trudeau can do other than watch and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Justin, of course, is what you meant there.
Sorry, excuse me.
But, Joanna, I want to bring you in now on this matter as well, because John has twice referenced the fact that Ottawa not only has a challenge now with Danielle Smith in Alberta, but also given the Legault second majority, and really a larger majority than the one that he had at dissolution of the National Assembly, that Ottawa is now going to have to deal with perhaps a more aggressive Quebec as well. How do you think that changes the dynamics? We heard John's thoughts on that. What are your thoughts on the fact that it is not just Alberta now, but also the addition of Quebec and a much more empowered Legault?
Yeah, I think it presents a real problem for the federal government in a continued way, in that, right from the outset, frankly, of the Quebec election, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. We were talking about on day one, this was in fact a race for second place. The support for Premier Legault was just so massive, and that support was coming at a time when this is a government that has been putting forward some legislation that causes real problems for the Liberal government, particularly the Liberal government that has been putting itself so much out there on issues of diversity, of inclusion, right? That's really staking its claim there. And we have these laws in Quebec, Bill 21, Bill 96, where the Quebec government has preemptively invoked the notwithstanding clause, so that anyone who wants to fight them can't challenge them in court. And these are, at a time when the Parti Québécois, which was always considered the biggest threat to Ottawa, right, and it with its dream of Quebec sovereignty, at a time when that party's really not a force right now, you have a different government, a different party that has said, like, leave that aside, but it's almost, I think, we're getting to a situation where the sovereignty aspect doesn't really matter. Like what they're getting now is already this power, already so much autonomy, and over matters that I think this, the federal government generally, but this federal government in particular under Trudeau cares a lot about. There was that reference to Pierre Trudeau. He famously was against the notwithstanding clause, and Justin Trudeau has said that he shares that view, and he told the Canadian Press in an interview last year that what he was particularly concerned about was this use of the notwithstanding clause preemptively. He says that sort of wasn't really the intention. It was meant to be a safety valve, right? And now we're sort of seeing it used in this way. So that sets up a fight. But if the Quebec government was just promoting this and doing this and going ahead on its own, but was very, very unpopular with the big parts of the population, that'd be one thing. But they have won an even bigger majority they had before, and clearly, went to election on these issues and had so much support from people in Quebec. So it's a little harder for the federal government to say that Legault doesn't speak for Quebecers when so many have voted for him.
Yeah, which goes to say there will be challenges on more than one front for Ottawa in the months ahead. So, of course, we'll keep talking about that. But for now, Joanna, John, do stand by. We're going to take a break, but we'll get back to you a little bit later in the program. The Prime Minister ended the week by announcing new sanctions against Iran. They include unveiling new measures that would permanently ban members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard from entering Canada.
We're using the most powerful tools at our disposal to crack down on this brutal regime and the thousands upon thousands of individuals responsible for its heinous behavior.
Well, for his reaction to the announcement, we're now reaching out to Farhad Rezaei, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Philos Project in New York. Dr. Rezaei, thank you for being with us again.
Thank you for having me again.
Let's begin with your reaction to these new sanctions from Ottawa, the banning of thousands of people, all part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, from ever entering Canada. How powerful a message is that?
Well, I welcome the decision, but in fact, it's far from enough. The IRGC is a notorious and the largest terrorist organization in the world, with a well-documented record of violence, either by working on its own or with its proxies. Its domestic enforcement group, the Basij militia, is also suppressing protesters as we speak by using the most brutal and violent methods. The IRGC is a very large organization. Banning some small part of it does not send the right message, especially as Canada has a very good human rights record. Let's not forget that the IRGC is responsible for the death of Canadian citizens. So I believe the decision to sanction only 10,000 forces of the Revolutionary Guards does not actually recognize the fact that the Revolutionary Guard is a terror organization.
Well, let's pick up on that point, though, because as you know, the Conservatives have been pressing the Prime Minister and his cabinet to do more, to actually declare the Revolutionary Guard a terrorist entity. The government, as you say, did not go that far, although it was interesting to listen to the Deputy Prime Minister defending this move. Take a listen to what we heard from Chrystia Freeland during that announcement.
The Iranian regime is a state sponsor of terrorism. It is repressive, theocratic, and misogynist. The IRGC leadership are terrorists. The IRGC is a terrorist organization.
So she's using the words without the formal declaration. So what is the distinction here? What, in not actually declaring the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist entity, where do these sanctions and actions fall short?
Well, as I said, the government clearly said that the Revolutionary Guard is a terror organization. But as I said, the sanctions that follow, the practical step that the government is going to take is actually falls short of recognizing this fact that the Revolutionary Guard is a terror organization.
Which I accept, but what, in practical terms, recognizing it or declaring it a terrorist entity, what does that do that the current announcement does not?
Well, first of all, we need to know that designation of Revolutionary Guards as a terror organization means that there would be no way that a Canadian citizen, a Canadian entity, or the Canadian government would deal with any company in Iran that is linked with the Revolutionary Guards. And the issue is that it is really hard to understand what firms in Iran are belonging to the Revolutionary Guards or which are not, because the Revolutionary Guards controlling the Iranian firms through pyramid ownership, which makes it extremely difficult to decipher who is who and what is what. That's first. The second thing is that, as I mentioned, Revolutionary Guards is a large organization. It has between 150 to 190,000 active members. Sanctioning 10,000 only, that means the rest of the members are allowing to enter the Canadian soil, which is a big problem because there are reports that there are several reports that the Canadian government has a lenient policy with regards to the members of the Revolutionary Guards. There are reports that many IRGC or former members of the IRGC or their relatives and children are living in Canada. And these people have actually listed opponents of the regime, harassing them, intimidating them through social media by sending them messages with death threat and kidnapping. Let's not forget that the Revolutionary Guards tried to kidnap a prominent human rights activist in New York, United States. So this time around, this measure of sanctioning half of the Revolutionary Guards does not really prevent Revolutionary Guards from continuing such measures in Canada.
Dr. Farhad Rezaei, thank you. I appreciate your reaction today.
Thank you very much.
On Wednesday, decrees finalizing Russia's so-called annexation of Ukrainian territory were signed by Vladimir Putin. This was a follow-up to another event the week before when the Russian president signed treaties with 4 eastern regions of Ukraine, areas that have seen the heaviest and deadliest of fighting since Putin began his illegal invasion of the country. The territories lie between Crimea and Russia. They are Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. But the move is being widely condemned by the West and come as Ukraine continues to drive back Russian forces. Joining us now to discuss the latest is Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, Larisa Galadsa. What's your reaction to that development out of Moscow?
A fairly straightforward reaction, Michael. Those sham referendums were sham, and everything that follows from them is as well. It's political theater. It's the actions of a president who has lost control over a war that he started personally, and that many say he continues to manage personally. So there's zero legitimacy to his actions today.
Now, I do wonder, though, because whether or not the annexation is recognized by Kyiv, and clearly they do not, the Western allies do not recognize the annexation either, but does the fact that Russia is declaring these areas a part of its territory now, will that in any way change the engagement of Russian troops in those areas?
I can't speak for how Russia is going to engage what troops it has left, or it might be sending to those areas. But I can tell you, it's going to motivate even more the Ukrainian soldiers who are working extremely hard already on 3 fronts to liberate territories and to get back to the Ukrainians who have been living under occupation there. And I can tell you that is a real preoccupation here in Kyiv. Yesterday, I met with the minister responsible for reintegration of those temporarily occupied territories, and they're very, very concerned. For the last few days, Russia has not allowed any people to leave in humanitarian convoys or to get in and out, so they have blocked them off. And so the time is of the essence. So they're highly motivated. The Ukrainian authorities want to get to those people and get back every square inch of territory that is theirs.
Highly motivated, as you say. And to that, the United States is committing more military aid, about $625 million worth in the latest promise. But we are hearing some reaction from the Kremlin, because the Kremlin is warning against further aid. With Russian forces in retreat in parts of Ukraine, Moscow says that any further military aid from the United States will make the U.S. a direct combatant in this conflict. Should allies like Canada be worried about that kind of escalation in language?
Canada and its allies are laser focused on showing a steadfast, strong, united front against Russia's aggression, and that's what we're doing. And let's also pull back here and remember that that Putin and Russia, they've been making these claims and these warnings from the very beginning, even from before. So that it's nothing new, and Canada continues to work with its allies to show that strong resolve, to be even stronger as a result of the political theater and any dire warnings that Russia might be issuing.
Now, we did hear from the foreign minister last week, Mélanie Joly, saying that Canada does support Ukraine's accelerated admission to NATO. From your talks with Ukrainian officials, what are they saying about that?
They're saying to us very clearly that nothing has changed about their desire to join NATO. And last week they restated that in a very formal way. And NATO, for its part, says nothing has changed about the fact that the door is open to new members, that the decision is up to the allies to make, and that no country has a say, no one country has a say in who gets to join NATO. So I think, again, it's this show of consistency, of consensus, of unity, and determination.
Unity, as you say. So how quickly might that happen, do you think? And what kind of impact would that have on fighting the Russian invasion? Right
now, that is job number one, to fight the invasion with the resources that are being provided to Ukrainian armed forces by all their partners, and that is the focus for us. I can tell you for certain that is also the #1 priority for everyone here in this country.
Now, Ukraine is also asking for Canada's help on 2 other fronts. One has to do with war crimes, the other with landmines. And I do want to begin here with landmines first. President Zelensky wants Canada to lead an international effort to essentially clear its territory of landmines and shells left behind by Russian forces. Certainly, Canada has the expertise, but it also presents a dangerous undertaking. How is that request being received?
The Ukrainians, when they clear territory, when they liberate territory, the first thing they have to do is clear the landmines. So you can just imagine what kind of what kind of a challenge that is. But again, that has been a challenge for a very long time, and Canada's been supporting Ukraine with that since 2015. So it's nice and great that Ukraine is recognizing our leadership in this area. We have been providing training, mine action, education, and also supporting organizations like the Halo Trust to be here in Ukraine, to train Ukrainian miners, and to do that absolutely painstaking work. I was out there a couple of weeks ago watching it myself. The asks are going to continue to come in. Prime Minister Trudeau announced in June that we'd be committing another $15 million to mine action in Ukraine, and we're working very closely with Ukrainians themselves because, as you can imagine, the needs are much greater than that. So the question now is, how do we direct that assistance in the most priority areas per Ukraine's request?
That assistance, but is there any talk of Canada perhaps increasing the assistance? Because it seems that since Russia has begun this invasion, the number of mines, the number of shells left behind on Ukrainian territory has increased exponentially.
Yeah, that $15 million announcement in June was new assistance, and I think that we will.
But will there be an addition? But will there be an addition to that, given that the ask from Zelensky is more recent than June?
We would take all of these asks very seriously. I've been talking with a number of people in Ottawa over the last couple of days, and what strikes me is just how eagerly everyone is working, how faithfully everyone is working, and incessantly to do what we can to answer Ukraine's many requests. And landmines is an area we know well, and we'll continue to support Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other ask has to do with setting up a military tribunal to prosecute the Russian military and its leaders for aggression specifically. So how would that be different than the investigation currently being conducted by the International Criminal Court?
Canada was really proud to be the country that took the reference to the International Criminal Court in the first place. And as you know, and Canadians know, we support the work of the International Criminal Court strongly. The crime of aggression is one that we all want to see prosecuted, and Ukraine has made a proposal in that regard, and we and all of our like-mindeds are taking a look at that and understanding its implications. It is really important that together we raise the costs of aggression, and that we hold Russia and Vladimir Putin and all of his enablers to account for the invasion and for all the atrocities that have been committed since. And we'll stop at nothing to do that. There are many avenues that we can take, and we're going to do that in lockstep with our partners and with the Ukrainians, of course.
So, correct me if I'm wrong. It seems that you believe that that tribunal, which Ukraine wants, will happen with Canadian participation.
The crime of aggression needs to be tried. And that's what we're going to be reviewing Ukraine's proposal in that regard and getting back to them with our thoughts on it.
Ambassador Galadsa, really appreciate the time today. Thank you for it.
Thank you so much.
In the meantime, the U.S. president had a dire warning about Russia this past week. Speaking at a Democratic fundraiser, Joe Biden said, quote, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon." Biden went on to say he knows Putin well, and the Russian president, he says, is not joking when he talks about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological and chemical weapons. Well, we continue to watch the fallout from a story first published by Global News. There are reports that videos from the conservative leader's YouTube account included the tag of an online misogynistic and anti-feminist group. Now, those tags made it easier for members of this group to find Pierre Poilievre's public postings. And take a listen to how the Prime Minister spoke about it in the House.
Mr. Speaker, a lot of ink was spilled and a lot of admiration for the effectiveness of the Leader of the Opposition's campaign to become leader, using social media, using clever videos. We all marveled at his admiration for old wood. But what we didn't see, Mr. Speaker, was his choice to include deliberate reaches out to far-right organizations, including hateful anti-women organizations, to try and advance his own political gains. He has played too close to the line with extremists for too long. Now he's got caught. Will he admit it? Will he apologize? Will he take responsibility?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I condemned this organization, and I corrected the problem as soon as it became known to me, Mr. Speaker. But I condemn all forms of misogyny, including when the Prime Minister fired the very first female Indigenous Attorney General. Mistreated minority young women in his own caucus who had to leave politics, and I condemn him for when he dressed up in racist costumes so many times he forgot them all. We condemn it always, Mr. Speaker.
Now, the tag has been removed from Poilievre's YouTube videos. He says he was not aware of them, as you heard, and his office says they could not say who tagged the videos in the first place. So for more, let's bring back our journalist panel for this week. Joanna Smith is with the Canadian Press. John Ibbitson is with the Globe and Mail. Joanna, I'll get you to start us out. What was your reaction to this revelation?
I think it was, first of all, very, very good sleuthing by Alex Boutlier from Global News to go into the metadata of videos and find this. So my first reaction was, I wish we had that story, right? But no, my reaction was, this is an issue I think that Poilievre is vulnerable on, right? And I think his response, however, shows that he may know that and he's not willing to let it be a vulnerability. So what we saw there in the House of Commons was him saying, condemning the group that was tagged and saying as soon as he, learned of it, he removed it. So taking that action, but not apologizing. And I think, we saw Trudeau stand up and I think really look as if he knew that Poilievre might be vulnerable on this, and Poilievre stood up and threw some vulnerabilities right back in Trudeau's face, and made it personal and talked about his own vulnerabilities on an issue. He talked about the Jody Wilson-Raybould scandal. He talked about the fact that Trudeau had been caught wearing racist makeup on several occasions, and so I think what we're seeing here is a fight we're going to be seeing, frankly, between these two leaders for the next few years. Trudeau looking for situations and opportunities to use that wedge, and Poilievre finding different ways to throw it right back in a way that we may not have seen from previous leaders at this party.
Mm-hmm. John, what do you make of the use of this tag and the impact that's had now on Poilievre?
Well, look. The first thing I think we should point out is I don't believe in all the years that I have been watching Justin Trudeau that I have ever seen him standing in the House of Commons or even standing on a platform during an election campaign and using that kind of language to characterize his opponent. It was tough. It was brutal. It was frank. And Poilievre gave as good as he got. These two men, I suspect, are already at the level of despising each other. I think Justin Trudeau rightly sees in Pierre Poilievre a really mortal threat, the kind of threat that Andrew Scheer and Erin O'Toole didn't pose. And the two of them are going to go at it, daggers drawn for the next 2.5 years. And Pierre Poilievre has learned the one thing you never do when confronted by your political opposition is apologize. You never back down. Instead, you double down. And that's exactly what he did in the House of Commons. I don't know who put that tag in and why it was put in. It was obviously several years ago that it first happened. But I do know that you're never going to ever find a way to get Pierre Poilievre to stand in front of the House of Commons before a microphone and sincerely apologize to reporters and say that he deeply regrets his actions or the actions of his aides. He ain't going to do it. What he is going to do is counterattack more fiercely than he was attacked. And you saw that in the House of Commons. It is going to be a wild ride for the next 2.5 years.
Now, we have less than a minute here, but quickly to both of you. Now that the tag has been removed, the issue has been put out there, is it over, or will we see more on this story? Joanna, I'll begin with you.
I think we'll see more on this type of story. I think, whether he was involved in the actual tagging or knew about it or not is frankly irrelevant, in my view. I think he has been courting, his campaign has been courting, and, in their attempts to widen that tent, to bring back voters who had left for Maxime Bernier's People Party of Canada, to expand the base further. He has been courting a certain segment of the population that, associated with the Freedom Convoy and those sort of movements. And I think we're going to see things like this. I think in doing that, in attracting those people, there's certain ways to attract them, and we're going to be finding other situations where it may blow up in his face a little bit. I mean, we saw that, frankly, with the remarks by Jeremy McKenzie the other week as well. But I think, as John said, we'll continue to see him double down. Okay,
John, quickly to you.
Yeah, it's going to be, as I said, it's going to be a wild ride. Trudeau is going to find every possible opportunity to label Poilievre a racist, a misogynist, and any other ists he can think of. And Poilievre, rather than denying, is simply going to double down and accuse Trudeau of being tired, corrupt, and a hypocrite. And those will be on the quiet days.
Oh, we have interesting times ahead. Joanna, John, thank you for that. We'll get back to you in a moment. Stay with us.
It is becoming too easy for prime ministers, not in particular this one, but prime ministers generally, to simply say, I'm going to send in the army. And we do this without talking to the provinces, municipalities, and civil society about what they could and should do.
A bit of Richard Fadden there as he appeared before a parliamentary committee this past week, discussing his concerns about the use of Canadian forces as a response to natural disasters. Mr. Fadden is a former top national security advisor, and his words really reflect the view of many military officials who worry these domestic emergencies affect the combat ability of Canadian Forces personnel. Mr. Fadden, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now, I think there will be some people who may be surprised by your comments, given that Canadians are, as you know, very appreciative, very proud when they actually see Canadian forces helping communities in time of need. So why is there this concern about the use of military assets as a response to natural disaster?
Let me start by saying that there will always be some circumstances where it's necessary to draw on the military as the resource of last resort. The challenge, it seems to me, is the definition of last in last resort. Over the course of the last, decade or so, we've seen a significant increase in the number of natural disasters, or what is euphemistically called disruptive events. And increasingly, the military has been asked to involve itself in dealing with these events. There's nothing inherently wrong with this unless you start worrying a little bit about the capacity of the Canadian forces to train operationally and to be ready to do what they're supposed to do as a military. I don't think the Canadian forces today, and for some time now, have had sufficient resources, money and time to train operationally. And if you put this in the context of the evolving geopolitical situation around the world, where it's more likely they'll be asked to go abroad to do things, for example, with NATO and Estonia, they need to be trained. And every time we draw on them to do domestic things, it takes them away from operational training. Secondly, I think it gives rise to the question of, are we doing enough on the civil side, federally, provincially, municipally, and otherwise, to make sure that there's a balance in who helps when we have these disasters?
Okay, we'll pick up on that point in a second, Mr. Fadden, but I want to get back to your first, this idea that having Canadian forces respond for all natural disasters takes them away from training. And that's based on what? The number of times the forces have been called in the past recent years?
I think it's a function of the number of times they've been called upon. It's also, I think, a function of the military having difficulty in recruiting the numbers that they want, that they need. So there are fewer people available to do disaster relief without being pulled away from operational training or from being abroad. It really is a variety of issues which suggests that they should only be used as a resource of last resort. I want to emphasize again, I'm not arguing against their being used. I just think that we should make sure that non-military resources are being used whenever it's possible to use them, and only when it's absolutely necessary do you have recourse to the military.
Mm-hmm. But and you referenced it a little bit off top, but if not the members of Canadian forces, who would be used? From a practical stance, is there really any other entity in this country that can be mobilized as quickly and as effectively?
Well, I think that gives rise to the question of why are the Canadian forces mobilized? And I think you can put into three large buckets how we use the military to deal with disruptive events. The first is logistical. The second is administrative. And the third is simply manpower, simply bodies of the sort that are being used right now in the Maritimes to cut trees and whatnot. In the first bucket, logistical, I think you could probably argue that, using attack helicopters to move bedding across the country is not the best use of those resources. If you have no other option, then you use them for that purpose. But it seems to me that if we did more planning for disasters, if we involved the provinces, the municipalities, and the private sector, we could have standing contracts available that would permit this sort of logistical support to take place or to originate from elsewhere than in D&D. And incidentally, given the cost of using D&D resources, if we do this carefully, we could probably save some money. Mm-hmm. I acknowledge that on the manpower side, if you just need a lot of bodies, D&D is ideal. But not every resource, not every disaster calls for manpower of that sort. And in the middle, what I call administrative work, it's registering people to receive financial aid. It's registering people to give them places to stay and whatnot. And I think we have to look at what we ask the Canadian forces to do in disasters in these three large buckets. And it would vary depending upon circumstances.
Well, and let me jump in because we're quickly losing time, but I do have to ask about any kind of international example from which Canada might learn, because certainly the United States has the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They have FEMA. Is that something that you're talking about in terms of replacing what D&D currently does?
What I'm arguing for is for Canada to have a holistic look at emergency planning and disaster planning. It's something we haven't done for a long time, and I think it's something that we need to do to determine what is the best mechanism. The United States' use of FEMA worked very well for them in some circumstances, less well in others. I don't know if that's what we want to do here, but I do think we could probably increase the collaboration, the cooperation between the three levels of government, between civil society and with the private sector. But it's unfair, I think, to give the Prime Minister, in the case of disasters, only one option, which is to call in the Army. I think we need to think about how we might be able to do this in other ways. For example, the Canadian Red Cross and similar organizations have a vast capacity to mobilize people and resources. Is this fit into our disaster planning as much as it possibly could be? I don't know, but I think a public inquiry would help us determine this and possibly plan better for the future.
Mr. Fadden, good to speak with you. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
And a postscript to that interview, as we were talking to Mr. Fadden about military resources being stretched too thin, on Thursday, the Chief of Defense Staff General Wayne Eyre ordered an immediate halt to all non-essential activities. Citing an unprecedented crisis in personnel numbers, Eyre says operations will be reviewed in order to identify which missions are no longer critical, allowing staff to instead focus on recruitment and retaining the members the forces currently have.
Today, we are announcing that we have established the Public Order Emergency Commission, an independent public inquiry that Justice Paul Rouleau will serve as commissioner.
Now, that was Minister Bill Blair back in April, and that Public Order Emergency Commission will begin its work in earnest on Thursday to determine whether it was appropriate to use the Emergencies Act to deal with the convoy occupation of Parliament Hill and the precinct, or whether it was an overreach. So, with their thoughts ahead of the work beginning in the days ahead, let's bring back Joanna Smith of the Canadian Press and John Ibbitson from the Globe and Mail. Joanna, it may be obvious to say, but this commission is not looking at whether or not the Emergencies Act was effective. Rather, it's about justification. Talk to us about this important distinction.
Yeah, and I think it's not just a general inquiry into what happened with the Freedom Convoy. I think we're going to be getting lots of really interesting information and answers to questions we might all have, in terms of hearing from some of the organizers involved and hearing from police and all that. But this is really about, it's a mandated commission to look into whether or not the Emergencies Act, the invocation of the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history, was justified. So we're going to be getting, a peek behind the curtain of, hopefully anyway, some of those cabinet decisions and things that they were basing it on. And what I'm really keen to learn was maybe they'll conclude that it ended up being necessary. Maybe they'll conclude it wouldn't have been necessarily had other things not gone so terribly wrong in the weeks leading up to its invocation.
Mm-hmm. And John, for this work to be successful, the government does have to be transparent. Any indication that that's what we're going to get?
Well, so far the indication has been the opposite. So far, the government's position has been we had to impose the Emergencies Act because the situation required it, but we can't tell you what the situation was that required it. That's not good enough. Remember, this has happened before under, yes, another Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau, when he invoked the War Measures Act in 1970 during the FLQ crisis. I was a teenager at the time, and I remember how frightened everybody was at what was going on in Quebec, and were we about to lose the country. And there was broad support for the War Measures Act, broad support for tough action by the federal government. But even in the early days, there were some politicians, especially NDP, who were questioning whether we needed to suspend habeas corpus in order to fight this. There were columnists in newspapers, including my own, that questioned the need for this. And as time went on, more and more voices were raised asking, did we really need to suspend civil liberties in order to contain the FLQ in Quebec? And over time, the answer came back, no, we didn't. Pierre Trudeau probably overreached. There probably was no need for the War Measures Act. And indeed, the Emergencies Act was brought in in order to not have to use such a sledgehammer during a time of a public emergency. But we still have the same question now that we had in the wake of 1970. What was going on that caused the cabinet to decide that it had to suspend some, not anything like the War Measures Act, but some civil liberties in order to contain what was going on at the border and what was going on in Ottawa? Was it justified? Was there a real threat to peace, order, and good government? Or was the government simply overreacting because it had a situation that it couldn't control and wanted to bring the hammer down and use this act in order to do it? That's what we need to know.
Mm-hmm. So with that then, John, what will you be watching out for? Who do you actually want to hear from?
Well, I think the Prime Minister is going to testify, and we'll want to hear from him. But you know what? It's not a question of who. It's a question of what. What did Cabinet see? What were the documents? What was the testimony from RCMP and from other police officials that caused them to believe they had no choice now but to invoke the Act? It doesn't really matter who says it, so long as that person is credible, but they have to present the case. And if they fail to present the case and simply say, well, you know, cabinet confidence is nothing we can do about that, then we really have lost permanently some of our civil liberties, because we've established the precedent that cabinet can invoke this act whenever it wants and then not have to explain itself afterwards. And that is not a precedent that would be that anyone who values their civil liberties should welcome.
Joanna, what are you watching out for?
I want to see the documents. There was a lot of back and forth, with some testimony from ministers at committee over suggesting that they weren't going to turn over documents, and then they said, oh, they could. And then finally in June, they agreed to provide sensitive cabinet documents to the inquiry. And they said that this would include all the inputs that would for cabinet. So I really want to know what those inputs were, and I think also we can expect that the federal government's not just going to hand over everything wholesale. I mean, this is a commission of inquiry. They are going to be having their own lawyers go through everything. So I'm hoping that we get to see as much as we possibly can see. I'm not too optimistic that they'll take a liberal interpretation of what they have to turn over. But I think, I'm hoping that what is there will be quite revealing. I think the whole point of this is that we need to know what they knew when they made that decision, and we don't know that. There's been a lot of just trust us on this, and this inquiry I'm hoping will show, that we we'll just know. We'll know more, and we can all decide whether or not it was worth it. But at least we'll know what they were thinking.
Well, at least we know what we're going to be doing next week. Listen, Joanna and to John, thank you for that. Really appreciate the conversation. Joanna Smith, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press, who joined us to be part of this weekend journalist panel. John Ibbitson, columnist and staff writer at large for the Globe and Mail. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is our program for this weekend here on Primetime Politics Weekend. I'm Michael Serapio. On behalf of everybody here, thank you for joining us. A special note that we will have special programming Wednesday night ahead of the Commission getting off to its work in earnest, so do stay with us for that later in the week. But for now, thank you. We'll see you next time.